Hello, I'm Jason Skill. This is Painting with Skill Lesson 17. In this lesson we'll look at how to create landforms. In Lesson 16 I was showing you the idea of bringing in forms of landscape like this set props being brought in from the side. So everything's just basically slid in horizontally into the picture. So carrying on from that, let's look at that idea, but we'll look at it in terms of paint. So we're looking at a piece of land, a strip of land that is that shape. Let's look at one of the ones we were using in the previous video. This is one of the strips that I made as the stage set prop. So that's what you're thinking of. You're thinking of a basic shape that is flat on the bottom and then you make it slightly bumpy on the top. So this is flat on the bottom and then bumpy on the top, and then you fill in the middle. Now, if you haven't made this sort of shape before, I would just practice making that. Flat on the bottom, and then push the brush up, and then play, as it is with this, to a little bit more interesting so that there's bumps and humps and hollows in that landscape, and keep that flat. And actually that in itself is quite a little skill, because what you'll do as you start is probably something like this. You kind of just make it very, very simplistic. Maybe a couple of bumps in the landscape, then flat on the bottom. And the trouble is, without much subtlety in how that top edge is created, it can look a little bit like kind of Ivor the Engine in landscape that's just sort of rounded, humps and hollows that look very cartoony. So what I would do is practice that top shape too sharp and it'll look like a series of mountains, and too rounded and it'll look too simplistic. So just slightly twitch your hand as you move, and then concentrate on making that bottom one flat. Now if this is a bit of land that sticks out into the sea, what you could do is practice flat bottom to it and then a little bit that sticks beyond it, as if the landscape has been eroded by the sea and this is a little bit of rock or land that's further away. You could even do two, but keep them on the same horizontal. Okay. Now, as was explained in the previous video about overlapping these flats, what you do is you take one of these and then you overlap it with another, and then you get this effect where it basically drops back and then comes out again, then drops back. So what you're doing is you're taking one of these shapes that you become reasonably practiced at creating and then putting another one in front of it. The difficulty is really doing it without thinking of it being the outline shape. But let's first look at it as the outline shape so that you kind of understand what's going on. Slightly twitch my hand there to make the top more interesting, and then I'm going to draw the bottom line. I'm not really advocating that you create them like this, it's just so that you get the process of what you're actually doing, thinking it through. And then what I want to do is put another one in front of it and over the top. So let's just do that by kind of paint drawing it. So I'm putting another one in front of it and then I'm dropping that over. So there's the first one and then the second one sitting over the top. But what you would actually see is all of this filled in. So you've got two pieces of land. In your mind, that's what you've done. You've overlapped the first one with the second one, but you're only actually seeing it as one mass. So if I wanted to overlap a third time, all I in effect need to do is to drop the landscape down and create another new flat. So if I just drop this down and then bring that back, I'm adding a third piece of landscape. But if I highlight this, say with blue here, what I'd be doing is I've actually be putting a new piece in front of there. So again, if I go back with the blue and I highlight this, that's kind of what you're doing. You're making one shape sit in front of another, in front of another. And once you've got this basic principle, it becomes quite easy to basically, I would suggest, paint the first flat line, point the brush a little bit at this end so it's not stub-ended, and then slowly kind of twitch the brush up, but keep that as a full form, and then drop it back. It doesn't have to drop back a long distance to make your next piece of landscape, and then your next overlapping piece, and then you drop back. The other thing that you want to practice doing is that you go in front. So you start with one like this, and then the next one goes in front of it. Now you could do it so that it drops back a little bit and then peeks out the front. I found that the most easy way of thinking it through, because just overlaying just feels like you're making one bigger piece of land. So let's do that. Let's make that top shape slightly stuttered, flat on the bottom, and then we're going to come forward this time, but you've still got that bit where it sticks back and then comes out and then goes back. So again, I'll use the blue just to highlight again what you're actually doing. What you're doing, this piece of land is coming up here, just make that a little bit stronger. That's kind of coming up, say like this, sticking out. That's what you're thinking in your mind, but you don't necessarily have to paint that. And then if you wanted to go out again, you'd come forward and then drop back as a flat. And it's, although this seems very simple, it's quite hard at first to get your mind around this and create landscape using this method. So let's take a new piece of paper and let's start to move them back and then move them forward. So you've got a distant landscape. Imagine this is next to a lake, it's probably the easiest way of thinking this through. So you keep the bottom line flat, which is why you've got an excuse for it to be flat if it's sitting next to, say, a lake. And then we make this twitch slightly up and down, and then we're going to come back. So there's a water, it's an inlet into here, and we're coming back, and when we keep that flat, and then we're going to maybe, let's drop back one more time as we did in the previous example. So now we're dropping back, keeping that flat, and now we're going to move a little bit further forward. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dare ourselves to move forward as in the previous exercise, and there we are dropping forward, fill that with a bit more paint, and then we're going to come forward, leave that little inlet coming back, and come forward, keep that flat, and then again let's dare to do that one more time, moving forward and then keeping that flat. Now I'm right-handed, and it's easier for me to think of the landscape that way. Coming in, somehow in my mind, it's easier to have the stuff come in towards the left from the right. And when you've got that easier way of thinking it through with me, in that sort of side bit, then you've got to face the task of reversing that and thinking of the stuff coming from the other way. So let's look at that, and for those people who are left-handed, this may be easier to think through. Anyway, so let's come now from this side. So we're going to, there's our first piece of land, that drops there on the flat, slight bumpiness. By the way, it's often better to be slightly higher at this end rather than drop it down. It usually looks better. And then I'm going to come along, so let's do the flat. You might find it easier to think like that, and then I'll finish to a point, and then I'm going to drop down, and then I'm going to finish to a point. Now I've come about the same level. In fact, let's just peek that forward. Or we could do little cheaty things like this. Like just basically keep that one, just peek that in front of it. Now it now looks like that's sort of one of these stick out bits. If I just elongate that a tiny bit, then make that flat, it looks just a little bit more convincing. It's the same kind of idea. Just basically slightly flatten that, and then we can maybe drop this back. Things that make this stuff look more convincing is those little bits that stick out. So let's have a couple of bits of sort of rocky outcrop that's broken away, say into the water. That kind of stuff makes a big difference on it, but looking more realistic. Now once you've got this basic principle going of the forward and back, and you're basically thinking horizontally, just keep it that way. It's not very correct in terms of perspective, but it looks reasonably convincing in picture making. What you can do is you can basically start to play with that idea and be a little bit more creative in what your brush mark will do. So I might do something, maybe tap it out, and then maybe draw it back, and then maybe that would come out with another thing that sticks up and goes out, all on that kind of flat So I might make a big drop back, maybe a few little bits that stick out, and then come forward. All of these still thinking, soaring your way horizontally. And practicing that over and over, that basic land creation principle will enable you to make some great little landscapes where you can use wet and wet, which we'll be looking at shortly, and it's a way of creating some very basic land. Now, the most simple way to make this look more effective is play from light to dark. So let's just look at that briefly. I'm going to make the first one, I'm just going to take the colour that I was using, that was cobalt blue and some raw umber, and I dilute that in the water pot. And I'm going to make the first ones reasonably pale. I'm going to come back and drop down, and even from the first to the second, I'm going to just now add a bit more paint. Now, rather than dipping into the more fluid section, I'm just adding a little bit more raw paint into the dampness of the brush, and just add that a bit to that, and it's not only changed its colour slightly, so the two colours intermixing becomes interesting. And now I'm going to come forward a bit more paint, a bit more weight, and I'm going to drop it down one more time so it becomes slightly stronger. And then a little bit more water, a little bit more paint. I'm going to beef it up now. I need this a bit stronger still. So more pigment in this. Still need fluid, don't need it dry, but I need more paint. Now I'm going to come forward again. So every time I drop forward with another bit of landscape, you just add a bit more weight of paint to it. Let's now dare ourselves to come, instead of dropping back to the right hand side, I'm now going to come forward to the left and then drop back. Let's give ourselves a little bit of a headland piece here and then drop back. And can you see that as it's getting darker, it appears to be becoming more solid and more towards us, and the lighter the colour is, the more it falls away. So let's really beef up that brown now into it, because it's gone a little bit blue. Just by changing the colour, it'll appear to be a bit more three-dimensional, a bit more thick, a bit more sticky. So slightly less water in it now, slightly heavier. I don't want to drop forward again. Let's do that. Keeping it flat at the bottom, don't start going tipping up and down. And then again, a bit more of the blue, but a lot more of the brown. Less and less water, because otherwise I just keep adding water, it keeps diluting it. So stronger. Let's drop back again. A bit more of the blue, a bit more of the brown. Much heavier now. Not so it's dry, but just so it's got more body to the paint. Can you see how that basic principle of dropping forward and back and creating those little bits of land masses, in conjunction with the paint getting slightly heavier, slightly thicker, is a very good way of simply creating land moving towards you in a way that's reasonably convincing. So if you're making something up, or even if you're looking at a landscape and think, oh, I could adapt and use some of these ideas in it. There's many a time I've looked at landscape and kind of simplified it in this way, looking at photographs and landscape when I'm sitting in plein air. So I hope that's helpful. What we'll be doing next in the next video is looking at the basics of wet in wet control. So we'll start to do some wet and wet and bring all these things we've been looking at together.